So thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'll bank the best travel book of the year. There was an adjective in front of that, which was fishing travel book of the year, but anyway, that'll do. Yes, I've never worked for the Environment Agency, but I did publish an anthology of writing about chalk streams about 15, 16 years ago, and had noticed that the Environment Agency list of chalk streams was incomplete, because I certainly knew of some in Norfolk that weren't on it. So I set about trying to do a more complete index. And I'm still actually working. I then did the same thing for WWF, and now I'm working with Natural England to try to get a really thorough index of all the English chalk streams, which is quite an exercise. And I will talk a little bit about what a chalk stream is, actually. So yes, I've been asked to chair this National Restoration Forum or panel, and our first task is to try to come up with a chalk stream restoration plan or strategy for all English chalk streams. And I've been working pretty non-stop on it for the last 5 or 6 months. We're nearly ready to share a draft. Hopefully, the Cam Valley Forum and the various rivers trusts and CAVA partnerships and stakeholders of all sorts will be able to see a draft in May. We're just doing first consultation with sort of experts and so on at the moment in April. So I have to sort of caveat that this presentation this evening is not an official CABA group presentation. It's my own presentation and my own take on certain issues, which aren't necessarily takes on issues that everyone would agree with, although I hope most people would. So yeah, so what is a chalk stream? Oh, my thing's not doing a scroll now. So, well, so I'll start there. Many of you will know all of this, but the story of chalk began in a much warmer world about 100 million years ago, when sea levels, there was no ice and sea levels were much, much higher. So that little map of the globe there shows you a very submerged Europe. The supercontinent of Pangaea had started to break up. The Atlantic Ocean was opening, and over the surface of Europe was a shallow and very pure sea. Because water levels were so high, there weren't many rivers to spill water into the sea, so it was very clear. And the little strange creature there on the right is called a Cochleaphore, and the little circular shield-like platelets in which it has wrapped itself, its little single-cell thing that's seen through a microscope, those are called coccoliths, and they are what form chalk. So the Cochleaphore swarmed by the countless gazillion in this prehistoric infinity pool of Europe, and then as they lived and died, they rained down onto the bed of the sea, a very pure sea into which there were very few impurities coming from the rivers, and accreted over time to form what then a sort of porridgey ooze that then became chalk. And if you think that chalk was deposited at a sort of infinitesimally slow rate, it's a sort of matter of centimeters every 100,000 years, and you stand at the cliffs of Hunstanton, which are really quite modest in comparison with that's Hunstanton where I live, quite modest compared with the White Cliffs of Dover, and you consider their height, then you've got some sort of concept of the amount of time that the Cretaceous era in which those chalk seas were laid down lasted. It all ended when a meteorite hit the Yucatan Peninsula and turned off the eustatic engine of chalk creation, the seas, and the earth plunged into a sort of nuclear winter, and things were reset. So now you have to imagine a cake. So the cake are the layers. You can go from the chalk there, you see, which is actually white and red chalk, to the layers of the cake. They're the layers of rocks laid down over time. Let's just say that the icing on top is everything that's been laid down since the Cretaceous era. The green is the chalk, and then underneath that there are other older layers, green sands, galt clays, Jurassic, Triassic layers. Now, you've got to angle your cake in a, I know it's circular, but angle it in a sort of northeast, southwest direction. bring it slowly above the surface of the water as more and more of the Earth's water gets locked up in the ice caps until it's now above the surface of the waves. Now tilt it slightly and now cut it off at the side with a cake knife, which is the equivalent of a glacier. And what you'll be left with at the surface is layers and layers of rock exposed, of which chalk is just one layer. And this map, this rather beautiful map, which was the world's first geological map drawn by William Smith, shows the chalk exposed at the surface here as a layer of green. And then it does extend, of course, you're right in the middle here in Cambridgeshire, up to Norfolk, and then it dips under the wash up into Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. So that is the extent of the chalk in England. And there is, of course, some part of the same sea floor across the pond in Normandy. And there is actually much more chalk across the breadth of Europe, across the Urals and into sort of Kazakhstan and places like that. So why aren't there chalk streams in those places? Why are all of the chalk streams as we know them 85% English and then the remaining 50% Northern French? Well, it's to do with this strange collision of geology and time and glaciation, because what the subsequent weathering of the Earth has done is it's worn all the rocks away to the north and east of that green line, and then everything dips away to the south and west. So, sorry, I got that, to the north and west of the green line, it's worn everything away, and then everything dips under the surface to the south and the east. So that the chalk actually dips under London, for example. That blob you can see poking in along the south coast there, the Sussex Weald, that's actually older rocks. That's where the chalk has almost sort of burst open, if you like, and the younger layers are either side of that older sort of clay and green sandy kind of geology. So only along that band of chalk that stretches from Dorset up through Wiltshire and Hampshire and Buckinghamshire and Berkshire and round the south of London to Kent and round the north of London through Hertfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Suffolk and Norfolk, and then dips under the waves at those chalk cliffs I just showed you at Hunstanton and reappears in Lincolnshire, and then dips under the Humber and reappears in Yorkshire. Only along that band of chalk do you get chalk exposed at the surface and polished clean by glaciers, which gives birth to about 224 little spring-fed rivers, which we know as chalk streams. So they're globally extremely rare. Now they are divided. People ask me all the time, well, what's a chalk stream? And of course, they are different. So I've done a little bit of work with a geologist called Hayden Bailey, who's helped me group them into 4 families of chalk stream. And you'll no doubt want to know what your groups are, but I'll tell you in a minute. So the classical chalk stream is the group A. That's the slope face rivers that flow along the longer slope of the chalk, so dipping in a southeasterly direction. And most of the classic chalk streams are slope face chalk streams. So the River Test, the River Itchen, the Kennet, the Piddle in Dorset, most of the Chilterns rivers, etc., are in your group A chalk stream. But then there's another group which are not quite pure chalk streams. They're the mixed geology chalk streams. So I've called those group B. And they are typically rivers that rise on slightly older rocks, green sands, and then progressively flow through the chalk. So they rise on old rocks and flow through younger rocks, and they have a bit of green sand in their upper catchments, which does have some quite important implications in terms of water quality, but also the morphology of the rivers and river restoration, because they are slightly more flashy rivers, i.e. they respond to rain a little bit more quickly. You can see the slight tanny stain in that Dorset Froom. And so they're slightly more incised into the landscape. The third type are the Scarp face chalk streams. Those are the streams that flow in the other direction. They rise along the northwest facing slope of chalk, they tend to be quite short and very quickly sort of flow from the chalk onto those older rocks. So really classic scarp face rivers are the Ewan, the Fontmell in Dorset, the Letcombe in Buckinghamshire that flows from the Chilterns in the opposite direction to the direction everyone thinks about, towards the Thames, or the Tame first of all. But that's one in not far from you, the Babingley in Norfolk. And I would actually say that quite a few of your Cambridgeshire chalk streams are in that group, because that's the direction in which they're flowing from younger to older rocks. And then the fourth type is a sort of all-encompassing group, which includes Cambridgeshire and Norfolk, the northern end of the Chilterns, and everything north of there. And these are the rivers that were actually under the Pleistocene ice cap, as opposed to the rivers of Hampshire and Wiltshire and Dorset, which were on the edge of it. And so the chalk north of Luton, I suppose, has been more worn away. And there are also deeper levels of sort of post-glacial and periglacial deposits. And so you tend to get a slightly more mixed, again, you can see that's the Glaven in Norfolk, and it is a bit more incised than those really, really bright classical chalk streams of Hampshire. So those are the four groups, and the Cambridgeshire rivers, I think, are sort of group C and D by and large. So when we're thinking about a chalk stream strategy, I thought, well, the best thing to do is to think about this trinity of ecological health in chalk streams. There's three components. So we've broken it down like that, and we've looked at water quantity, water quality, and habitat quality. If all three of those are good, you're going to have a healthy river. Now, the important thing is that they're all interrelated as well. They're sort of multi-directional in effect. So it's all very well having really clean water, but if the habitat's poor, if it's running down a canal, you're not really going to see the manifested benefits of that clean water. It's all very well restoring flows, but if the flows are still filthy, polluted water and they're running down a sort of impounded channel, you're not going to see the benefits of restoring flows. It's by restoring all three of these things simultaneously that you get a sort of exponential increase in the ecological health of the river. Do them just one at a time and you will get an improvement, but it'll be a muted improvement in comparison with what you could do with all three. And nothing underlines that fact more than water quantity, because that is kind of fundamental. Without water, there is no river. So there's not much point in having water quality if you've got no water. Well, that's kind of oxymoron. And of course, morphological quality is kind of neither here nor there if there's nothing in the river. So water quantity is the building block of it, and that's what we looked at first, and that's what I'm going to look at first today here with you. That's the River Bean in the spring of 2017. It was a drought, but the river shouldn't be dry there. And the clue as to why it's dry there is hidden away in the trees behind, in the right-hand side of the picture. You can see one of those very architecturally distinctive 1950s through to 80s construction water pumping stations. So water abstraction, groundwater abstraction, which is the thing that threatens flows in chalk streams, grew markedly in the years after the Second World War. People were moved out of London to all the new towns around Milton Keynes and so on, and put an awful lot of pressure on what was seen at the time as almost a sort of limitless and wonderful supply of clean water under the ground. And so when the abstraction pumps were sunk back in the 1950s, there was generally a feeling, I think, that you could pretty much do it with impunity, although some early writers, and there's a very, very moving piece written by a man on the River Kennet mourning, it was called The Passing of a River, and he wrote it after just the single abstraction pump went in, and he noticed the difference. Well, Lord, did it make a difference later as the abstraction climbed and climbed through to a sort of an absolute height in the 1980s. And that height of abstraction in the 1980s, when some rivers were actually having more water taken out of the ground in some years than had actually fallen from the sky, and I'm not exaggerating. That reached a kind of apex where everyone really noticed in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I don't know if you remember, but there was a period of very dry weather, and our chalk streams literally dried up all over the place to the point where we could no longer ignore the problem. And the National Rivers Authority was formed in the late 1980s. And one of the first things they did is a report on this low flows crisis. And I picked out there on the right, the Hoffer Brook, which is not far from, maybe some of you are sitting beside it right now. I know Rob has done some work, Rob McGovern's done some work on that river. Was one of the rivers singled out as suffering from a low flows crisis. Of those top 40 English and Welsh rivers, 15 were chalk streams. Sadly, the Hoffer Brook was sort of relegated to not significant enough to do anything about, which I hope you guys will change. But that's the list of chalk streams that were identified by the National Rivers Authority in 1991 as suffering from acute low flows caused by groundwater abstraction. Now, why have I coloured the letters differently? Well, the ones in green are the ones which are no longer, 30-something years later, suffering from acute low flows caused by abstraction. So we've fixed 5 of them, but the remaining 10 we have not fixed. And the His and the Hoffer Brook are in orange because I can't say whether they're failing the Water Framework Directive flow because they haven't been assessed, which again is something perhaps you guys might like to agitate about, certainly in terms of the Hoffer Brook. Now, during that period of time, we've had an awful lot of reports and campaigns and charters, and I've been, partner in some of them. I helped WWF with Rivers on the Edge campaign. I don't know why I've managed to repeat some of the dates there. That was me hastily putting these together, so apologies for that. There's a slight repetition in the middle there. But we've had a number of reports over the years. They've all made this issue very clear, and they've all made the same complaints. I've actually grouped them here. So I've identified when the requests were made. They fall into the following sort of families. The need for modelling and flow targets, which was identified very early on by Natural England in 1999. Desire to modify the abstraction regime, realigning it, looking at different ways of abstracting water, reducing the demand for water through compulsory metering, targeting inefficiencies, building regulations. We've called for legislation. We've called for Ofwat to be charged with the duty of care for the environment. We've called for abstraction license reform. And we've called again and again for the protected designation of all chalk streams. And through that time period, the government and the Environment Agency has responded, and they've responded with the Alleviating Low Flows scheme, which evolved into a scheme called Restoring Sustainable Abstraction. They have responded by creating flow targets and flow indicators, and I'll talk about those in a little while. We've got catchment abstraction management strategies. We've got enhanced powers for the Environment Agency to revoke or vary abstraction licenses. We've got a thing called the Abstraction Incentive Mechanism. We've had the Water Framework Directive now transposed into UK law, and on the way we've got some reform of abstraction licensing. But we've still got dry and drying chalk streams. That's a little summary of what hasn't been delivered and over the years. And you can see, for example, compulsory metering. It was asked again and again, 2009, 2013, 2014, 2019. I sent a little note to your group just now, because if you're getting designated as a water stressed area, then I believe you can ask for compulsory metering, although I'm not absolutely sure about, but I think you can. So the point is that CAM has been hoofed down the road endlessly for year after year. And the reason why is because chalk streams are very delicate ecologically, so you can't actually take much water out of them before the ecology starts to suffer. But the southeast is full of people, and they all need water. So you have these two opposing forces. And when you've got two opposing forces, the line of least resistance is to get that can and hoof it down the road. But the problem began, and this is what I've really tried to focus on in the strategy. The problem began with the way the Water Act in 1945 was phrased. And it was phrased in such a way as to misunderstand or not take adequate account of, and I don't think they really knew then, the way a chalk stream works. So here on the left-hand side, it says, where the minister, he will not approve any agreement for the acquisition of abstraction licenses unless he has satisfied the agreement contains adequate provisions for the limiting the extent to which and the circumstances in which water may be taken from the stream and incorporate provisions from Part 3. So where the minister's worried that abstraction will substantially reduce the flow of the water in the stream, he won't give the license unless the conditions in the right-hand paragraph are adhered to. And the conditions in the right-hand paragraph allude to gauges that measure the quantity of water taken and the flow in the stream, and then a kind of hands-off flow idea, which is when the water drops below a certain level, then you stop abstracting it. And that's all very well and good and kind of obvious if you think about surface water abstraction. If you've got a pump taking water out of a river, you can measure the flow upstream of the pump and you can measure it downstream of the pump. And what you're taking out of the pump will be, you know, the upper bit minus the lower bit. And if you turn off the pump, then it all carries on down the river and the balance is restored. But a chalk stream doesn't work like that. A chalk stream is an oil tanker, not a speedboat. So when you manipulate the abstraction, it takes a very long time to respond. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how a chalk stream works. You probably, many of you will know this, but essentially a chalk stream is groundwater fed. It derives most of its flow from under the ground. Somewhere between sort of 80 to 90% of the flow will, in a natural chalk stream will come under the ground. It does vary according to those groupings I showed you earlier. Some get a bit more surface flow depending on the geology. The water sinks into the ground down to the aquifer. And where the aquifer intersects with the surface of the landscape, there you have what's called the saturated zone. That line used to be called the spring line. It's not anymore for a reason I don't quite understand. It's perhaps a little bit deceptive because the saturated zone will move up and down the valley depending on how deep the groundwater is. At the moment, we've got, certainly here in Norfolk, incredibly high groundwater. I've never seen it so high. And we've got streams and springs flowing where I've never seen them flowed before. And that is a direct response to the amount of water in the ground. There's also a mathematical formula, which I won't take you through because I'm not very good at maths, but I like the simple bit at the end, which is basically a 10% increase in the height of groundwater above the valley bottom amounts to a 25% increase in flows. Essentially what that is saying is it's the hydrostatic pressure of the water that is driving the flow, and the deeper the water underground, the harder the springs will be driven by the pressure of the water, but also the longer the river is because the saturated zone extends higher and higher up the valley. And I've got a, and that's a picture actually of the River Wye above High Wycombe, which is a rather good kind of photographic illustration of the diagram above. And that is actually pretty much the headwater ephemeral springs of the Wye. It sometimes flows from much further up than that, but that's where it flows from pretty reliably every winter. And then it does recede from there. And that furrow you see, that wetted furrow in the foreground, dries up. So this is some plots taken from the River Ver, which is a Chilterns chalk stream, showing how closely the flow in the river traces the groundwater levels. It's a very, very close affiliation. So basically there, you've got two rivers, the Ver at a gauging station called Hanstead's, and the Misbourne at Denham Lodge. But the actual groundwater levels are taken from neither valley. They're taken from Amersham Road, which is between the two. So this just shows you also the regional connectivity of the aquifer. So when the groundwater level at Amersham is 72 meters above sea level, that's the point at which the River Ver at Hansteads dries up. And every meter above 72 meters at Amersham Road will increase the water flowing down the river at Hansteads by 25%. And you can see it reads the same way on the graph below. Only at Denham Lodge, the river dries up when the groundwater level at Amersham Road is at 74 meters. So slightly differently, which is why you'll see chalk streams drying up in different places at different times as the groundwater rises and falls through the season. And this is the thing, it is a seasonal rise and fall. That's the oil tanker and the speedboat. The groundwater level in chalk area goes up through the winter and down through the summer. And nothing you do on June the 1st will make that groundwater level go back up again until it starts to recharge in the winter. So there's my really nice, simple way of explaining it. That's my back garden, a bucket in which I drilled a load of holes. I set a hose so that the amount of water going into the bucket on the left-hand picture exactly matched the amount of water going out of the bucket. So the hose is rainfall, the bucket is the aquifer, and the holes up the side of the bucket are your chalk stream. And with the lowermost hole being the lowest bit of the chalk stream and the uppermost hole being the most uphill end of the chalk stream. Then I added a groundwater abstraction by taking a cork out of another hole at the bottom of the bucket. That's the middle picture, and you can see that the groundwater level immediately starts to fall because you're allowing water to go out another route, i.e. groundwater abstraction. And it eventually falls to the point where, without touching the hose, the river on the right-hand side, as you can see, is much shorter, but also there's actually less water. I don't know if you can quite see that, but you can see the sort of power of water coming out of the extreme left-hand holes in the left-hand picture is much greater than the power of the water coming out of the bottom 4 holes on the right-hand picture. So you've got less power, less hydrostatic head driving the water, but also the river's just plain shorter because the groundwater level has fallen. So this idea of the 1945 Water Act and having a gauge that sort of looks after the environment, well, here's an extreme example of how that doesn't work. But you'll have probably, many of you will have heard, that should say hands off, sorry, bad typing. Many of you will have heard of the idea of hands-off flow. Well, hands-off flow is all fine and good if you've got surface water abstraction. This is a very extreme hands-off flow scenario, i.e. it never happens, but you know, it's a complete cessation of groundwater abstraction modeled for the River Kennet, with the complete turning off of the pumps on the 1st of June, which, as I say, it doesn't happen. Now, you might, 33% of that abstraction level is actually not what takes place on the Kennet. It's actually rather less than that on the Kennet, but it is comparable with the abstraction that takes place on most of the rivers in the Chilterns. And if you turn off the pumps on the 1st of June, the flow slowly recovers. That's the green line, but it hasn't got back up to natural until the following winter. So trying to turn the oil tanker around on the 1st of June, well, you'll get some kind of result by the following Christmas. This is much more like the sort of scenario which we've had to try to address the problems of low flows in rivers. So this is the abstraction incentive mechanism, where, and this is an actual modeled year, where flows on the River Kennet, I won't go into the mechanism, it's a little difficult, but it's kind of like a hands-off flow. It's basically when the flows fall below a certain trigger, just like in the wording of that 1945 Act, the water company can voluntarily lessen its abstraction below that point, and then they get credits. Well, you can see the green line. That's how much the flow recovers in this actual abstraction incentive mechanism scenario, this year being 2010. It does recover, but not as much as you'd actually notice in the river. So we've got our flow indicator, we got our flow targets. I mentioned those before. Our chalk streams, our rivers are divided into abstraction sensitivity bands. That's what ASB3 stands for on the left. And the little number I've circled, so that will be for your most sensitive river at your lowest flows. So Q95 means the flow that is exceeded for 95% of the year. So that is a low flow, whereas Q50 is exceeded for half the year. It's much higher flow. So our flow indicators, which are built into our sort of environmental legislation, are that we should only reduce flows by 10% at Q95 in a high sensitivity river. Most of your Cambridgeshire chalk streams are actually in ASB2, the moderate sensitivity band, and that's something that I believe should change. I think chalk streams should all be in the higher sensitivity band. The bands are actually to do with morphological type, so it doesn't make any sense to me that they should be in different bands from each other because they're all the same morphological type. But anyway, the point here is that to actually hit that target on the River Ver at Redbourne, which is the upper gauging station on the River Ver, your abstraction would have to be about 2% of the amount of water that falls from the sky onto the catchment and gets into the aquifer. And at the lower end of the river, the abstraction would have to be about 5%. If abstraction was 10% of the annual recharge of the aquifer, then flows at Q95 would be reduced from natural by about 40% at the very upper end of the river and 15% at the lower end. But 10% sort of, might be tolerable, because what we've actually got is abstraction on the Ver is about 35% of catchment recharge. And that amounts to a dry river at the upper gauging station for 1/3 of the year. You just go back there, 35% is somewhere between the pink and the lowest red line. So you can see the degree to which it's below the, sorry, I should have explained there, the dotted line there are the flow indicators, the environmental flow indicators. So it's not complicated. We're taking too much water out of the ground, and that's why our rivers are drying up and they don't meet the flow targets and flow indicators. This is the River Ver downstream. Q95 flows here are about 75% below natural. Not 10%, 75%. So this fact, the fact that chalk streams cannot take that much groundwater abstraction without being greatly denuded and cannot be micromanaged during the summer by twiddling with your abstraction level, because it doesn't make any difference because it's an oil tanker, not a speedboat, has considerable implications for the way we abstract groundwater from chalk streams, especially where the abstraction is not 10% of the catchment recharge, but 20, 30, or even 40%, as it is in the Chilterns. And I'm afraid I don't know what it is in some of your local rivers, although we are doing a survey to try to find out. But in these water-stressed places, and I'm sure you're in a water-stressed place, we should be taking far less water out of the ground and instead using surface water abstraction, which you can manage more sensitively, from the downstream end, the less ecologically sensitive ends of the river, and then where the flow targets can work more effectively. But that's a lot easier said than done. The issue is cost. Each megalitre a day of water from the chalk aquifer is worth about £2 million a year to the water company. So reducing abstraction on the River Ver from the current 27 to the ideal 7 megalitres a day would obviously cost a lot of money. Plus the southeast is full of people. Water use in places like the Chilterns is already high, demand is only going one way. We know what to do, and that's to turn the pumps off, but how on earth will we find the water to replace the water that's coming from the chalk aquifer? People have got to have water coming out of their taps. Well, it is a problem. The National Framework for Water Resources Regional Planning has been tasked with solving it, and it's working on that but looking ahead for 2024 to 2050. And priority will be given, I believe, to chalk streams. And very much in our plan, we will be very much asking for that to be the case. Options involve big infrastructure schemes like reservoirs, water reuse and desalination may become, very much more viable with sort of changes of energy and these are future thinking, nuclear fission, that sort of thing. regional networks to bring water in from less stressed parts of the country. So we could bring water from Lake Vyrnwy across to the Thames, for example, and better water management. But all this is going to take time. And is there anything we can do in the shorter term? Well, there's one idea which I've been pushing, and this is the idea that Alan mentioned earlier, specific to the Chilterns at the moment, which is probably the most stressed area. But Affinity Water has built into its current and approved business plan a pipeline called Supply 2040. And Supply 2040 is pretty much an integral part of all sorts of regional infrastructure supply solutions for water. It's a part of the Abingdon Reservoir solution. It's a part of the Severn to Thames conduit. And it's also there to take water from Affinity Water sort of surplus area south of the Thames to the water stressed areas in the Chilterns. But it just so happens that this pipeline would enable you to turn off the abstraction in all of those rivers. Because if you remember the bucket, well, had I put the cork back in that bucket, the bucket would have refilled. And that's what happens when you turn off the pipes, the pumps. The groundwater level recovers and the rivers start flowing again. And the modeling that we've looked at so far suggests that as much as 80% of a litre that you don't abstract from the headwaters of chalk stream becomes available as surface water flow at the lower end of the river. So you can take it out of the surface lower down, provided you can store it somewhere and then relocate it to the places that formerly depended on the groundwater supply. Now that is kind of how we should have done it. If we could go back in time and tell them how to do this system in the 1940s. Don't take all this water, you'll ruin the environment. Do it this way instead. This is how we should do it. But it's only possible at the moment in the Chilterns because of this pipe network. It does rely on quite a lot of infrastructure investment. And I'm very much hoping Affinity Water and Thames Water will run with this, because of course, when they build that Supply 2040 pipe network, they're only going to want to build it once. And it's ideal if they build it to actually accommodate this scheme. So there are some solutions on the horizon. And I believe chalk streams first would be a really good model for regional flow recovery in some iconic rivers, and a model for how we could do it elsewhere. And I'm very, very excited to hear that we've got some ideas in the offing for how to sort of replicate this scheme in your neck of the woods in Cambridgeshire. So I'm quite tight on time, so I'm going to get on to water quality now and try and get a bit of time for a few questions at the end if people would like to ask any. So another very complex, very sort of interrelated issue, water quality. Our chalk streams are polluted in a number of ways. They're, as you probably all know, very sensitive to pollution. Treated and untreated sewage, chemicals, oils and salts that run off our roads, particularly, you know, if it's been a long dry spell and then you get a downpour, get awful toxic flushes coming off, you know, particularly urbanized areas. Pesticides, herbicides and agricultural fertilizers, and also the soil, the sediment, the particulate that those pesticides, herbicides and fertilizers are actually attached to. And the proportions of these pollutants will vary catchment by catchment. Obviously, your more urban conurbated pollution are going to get more, catchments going to get more road runoff than somewhere, you know, out in the countryside, which might get more agricultural runoff. And sort of analysing that balance is quite complex, but you need to analyse it in order to decide how to prioritise what you do about water quality. So for the purposes of this evening and just keeping it sort of fairly approachable, I'm going to talk really about two, human sewage and agricultural pollution. So we can divide pollution types into point source. Point source comes out of a pipe, basically, at a specific place, like a sewage treatment works. But fish farms and salad farms are also point source suppliers of pollutant, particularly sort of phosphates and nitrates from either applied to the salads or as fish food and fish excrement, and also chemicals that applied to cress farms, which are creating big water quality issues in the salad farming part of the world. A lot of salad farming in Hampshire. And then your diffuse pollution, as the name implies, comes from all sorts of disparate places. The road network, farmland is the big one. There's a runoff event, which I photographed a few weeks ago, but also gardens, and there are, I've seen, in some little suburban chalk streams, you will actually, gardens will be, particularly if people are pretty vigorous with their pesticides, and septic tanks. But the big ones are the human sewage treatment networks and agricultural runoff. So that's what I'm going to talk about this evening. Now, phosphorus is the chemical present in sewage and agricultural runoff. They're the two biggest sources of phosphorus, and phosphorus is the key chemical that drives eutrophication in chalk streams. Well, what's wrong with eutrophication? They're fertilizers, essentially. Phosphorus is a fertilizer. Well, all plants thrive or suffer at a given concentration of phosphorus. So as phosphorus concentrations rise, so some plants will start to suffer and some plants will start to go, yummy, yummy, that's fantastic, thank you very much. Now, your chalk stream higher order plants like ranunculus, the good plants we want to see, thrive at very, very low natural background levels of phosphorus. And if the concentration rises, the chalk stream's natural plant community starts to suffer, and the river's ecology switches to a more algal dominated plant community. So you get a loss of biodiversity and you get algal blooms, and you'll all be familiar with them. The river turning a slightly sort of, non-chalk streamy color when the sun comes out in April, the sort of cloaking of the riverbed with benthic algae, again, in response to that sort of early spring sunshine. The epiphytic algae are the ones that cloak the plants, and they'll cloak ranunculus and stop it from photosynthesizing, but also ranunculus rooting becomes shorter as phosphorus concentrations rise. And so the ranunculus is more liable to be pulled out by high flows the following winter. And really large amounts of algae change the oxygen balance and create these sort of diurnal variations. So you get really low oxygen levels at night, which is rather like, trying to sleep with someone putting a pillow over your face. It's not good news, and it stresses fishes and insects alike. But don't forget also those benthic algae, in terms of the insects, they smother the rocks and they fill the spaces in which the river insects live. So that's the equivalent of being turned out of your house and then being asked to sleep with a pillow over your face. And just modest increases in phosphate can cause the ecological changes outlined above. That's modest increases. Unfortunately, there is miles more phosphorus in our chalk streams than there should be. The good news, there used to be even more. Phosphorus concentrations in our chalk streams, rather like abstraction going up in those terrible post-war years up to the 1980s, and abstraction reached its peak in the dreadful 1980s. And so did phosphorus applications to farmland, and it was present in detergents. And of course, we had the population growth in the southeast. Since then, phosphorus loading in our rivers has come down quite considerably, 60% in terms of the sort of total tonnage. So, for example, phosphorus levels in the River Lee, which is a London chalk stream into which the Misbourne and the, the Mimram and the Bean flow, has fallen to about the same level as just after the war. And these gains have been driven by a couple of pieces of legislation. The Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, which applies to large sewage works, so 10,000 people or more, and the Water Framework Directive, but with smaller and smaller sewage treatment works targeted in each year. So now many medium-scale sewage treatment works are fitted with phosphate, especially in vulnerable catchments. And we've also got SAC and SSSI designations for chalk streams, for some chalk streams. And those have also driven investment in sewage treatment works to the point where phosphorus is lower than it used to be. But that relief has not been provided evenly across the landscape. So here are two designated chalk stream catchments, the River Test and the River Itchen, probably our two most famous chalk streams. The Test is a triple SI, the Itchen is a SAC. So you can see that in the middle there, I've got a little thing for phosphate, and you've got 100% pass of the Water Framework Directive, with most of the water bodies in those two catchments being of high status. That's low phosphorus concentrations. And up the top, I've summarized it, 85% high, 15% good, that's a 100% pass. And sewage treatment works with 71.5% of the sewage treatment works have a tertiary treatment, i.e. the phosphorus is stripped from the sewage before it goes back into the river. What about the Cam Valley? So I drew you a little map today of your chalk streams. The green is the band of chalk. The sort of the green line across the front is that scarp face I was talking about, and dipping away to green sands and so on to the north and west. And those are your little rivers, a series of little kind of scarp face rivers on that run off that sort of saddleback of hills from Baldock to Royston to Cambridge. Then the River Cam and the Granta and the Bourne, and a couple of little small chalk streams that actually flow through Cambridge. You'll know them all very well. And here are some photographs of the Cam, Cambridgeshire's River Test, really lovely river, and also those beautiful little scarp face rivers that are tucked away, and probably not many really people know they're there, along that I was talking about along the saddleback of hills there. So how are they doing? P removal at sewage treatment works on the non-designated Cam and tributaries. 30% of your rivers are at good or high status, and 30% of your treatment works have phosphate removal. So it's kind of obvious, the causal link there. The one that sort of caught my eye, which made me look again, was the Mell, which was of high status, even though it has a sewage treatment works on it that doesn't remove phosphorus. So this afternoon, I had a slightly closer look at the Mell, and I've got a sort of Excel spreadsheet of the phosphorus readings. So this is your only Cam chalk stream of high status with a sewage treatment works which does not remove phosphate. There are two assessment points on the Mell, one upstream, just more or less in the middle of Melbourne, where the phosphate status is high, and the average of the readings is 0.012, which is very low, as you'd expect from a chalk stream. Downstream, however, the reading is 0.518, and the status is poor. It's 43 times higher. So where's the sewage treatment works? Well, you don't get Sherlock Holmes prize for guessing that it's right in between the two. So the point is that sewage treatment works that do not remove phosphate are still exerting quite an impact on our little Cinderella chalk streams. And that's my pie chart for the whole country. So on the left there are the chalk streams that fail Water Framework Directive for phosphorus. And you can see that if you look at, it's 58% have sewage treatment works that are secondary only, with also storm overflow problems. And a further 22% have upper greensand, which is a geological complication. Upper greensand does not bind phosphorus nearly as well as chalk does, so those rivers don't fare so well. So you're talking about nearly 80% there, whereas if you swing it the other way round, the ones that are high status, 57% of the high status chalk streams don't have a sewage treatment works of any sort. They don't have a storm overflow, and they're not upper greensand. And then the remaining 20% that are at high status, or a remaining 20%, have a sewage treatment works that is tertiary. So it's a pretty clear link there. And what my feeling is that investment thus far in sewage treatment works, while it's a good news story, and it's very much a move in the right direction, has left the little Cinderella chalk streams like the Mel and the Shep somewhat behind, and indeed the Cam. And a lot of rivers that I'm very fond of, the kind of slightly unloved or unknown chalk streams, not the ones we know well and the sort of more glamorous ones. These small sewage treatment works are almost definitively in the upper, more ecologically sensitive headwaters, because the statutory drivers apply, because of cost benefit apart from anything else, to your large sewage treatment works. Cambridge will have one. Cambridge will have a tertiary treatment. You're quite a long way down the river. You're a large conurbation, but your little headwaters are not benefiting from the tertiary treatment. So what can we do? Because the problem is it's expensive. And one answer I feel is integrated constructed wetlands. So I've got a couple of case studies here. The Norfolk Rivers Trust worked with Anglian Water to put in a couple of integrated constructed wetlands on two chalk streams in Norfolk, the Mun and the Ingol. And there's been some academic studies into them. Richard Cooper of UEA conducted a study into the performance of these, and it was very encouraging. And in fact, it's got even better since he finished that study. So while it indicated a 27 to 64% reduction of phosphate, and the 64 was at the more mature Mun works, because this study was done when the Ingol one was only a year old, and nitrate 72% reduction. The post results since that have been indicated maybe even up to a 90% reduction in phosphate, and at a cost of 31 to 39 pounds per person. These are a natural, cost-effective alternative to conventional tertiary treatment, where such treatment might not be possible and might not pass the dreaded cost-benefit analysis. And I think there's another potential role for these. And I asked around and found it'd been tried, and we're definitely pushing at an open door with this suggestion, using wetlands to tackle some of the groundwater ingress storm overflows you'll have been reading a lot about. So they've done that at Hanging Langford, where they get groundwater coming up every year and basically spilling into the sewage network and causing an overspill of raw sewage into the river. And they've taken that now through a large reed bed, an old lake really, where the bacteriological impact is described as imperceptible. In other words, the river actually shows higher bacteriological counts than the reed bed effluent. So there's another potential use there, because I think some of those groundwater ingress storm overflows are going to be very, very problematic to fix. So I am just about on time. Now, this is just my take. So you remember the generation game, Bruce Forsyth, you have to memorize everything that's going past on the conveyor belt. And what you manage to memorize, whether it's the Moulinex food mixer or the Colotelli or whatever's that which you get to take home, there are an awful lot of actions that we could do to make our chalk streams better. We may have to prioritize, although I definitely want to draw attention in our report to all of those actions. But my sort of generation game take home would be, can we get everyone to agree that sustainable abstraction, it's a term frequently used, rarely adhered to, is that which ensures a maximum reduction from natural flows of 10% at Q95? Can we get the water companies and the regulators and everyone to sign up to that? I think we can. They're nervous of it because, as I say, the cost implications are big and it might take a long time. But then if we can we set time-bound goals, not just vague aspirations, but time-bound goals to achieve that sustainable abstraction on all chalk streams? And I don't even mind if those goals are quite a long way away, as long as they're staged and we define the journey and the waypoints along the journey, and then we publish them and stick to them. And I think that's key to avoid the can kicking phenomenon. My next generation game take home would be chalk streams first. I know it favors the Chilterns, but that's where it can happen in a short time scale, where it makes sense to do it now when the pipework is being invested in, so we don't have to dig it all up and reboot it, put an extra lane on it in 5 years' time. And I do believe also that it would be a huge boost to our national morale to show what regional flow recovery across many of the chalk streams that are suffering from low flows would amount to. I think it would be fantastic. We would show that it's possible. and we would set a model for what could be done elsewhere. I would like to target the sewage treatment works that are quite clearly causing phosphate failures and eutrophication problems in the chalk streams that haven't benefited so far from the investment drivers that exist. And if they don't pass cost-benefit analysis, then let's look at the potential of integrated wetlands, because they seem to be a total no-brainer to me. They're very cheap and they're better than nothing. And in fact, they're a lot better than nothing. Can we look at integrated wetlands for solving or certainly mitigating some of those really problematic groundwater ingress storm overflows? I'm not talking about the sort of abuse storm overflows. I'm talking about the ones where groundwater's getting into the pipework because the groundwater's up so high. But also, can we set permit conditions on storm overflows that do justice to the international significance of our chalk streams? Because we are talking about the riverine equivalent, the English equivalent of the Okavango, the English equivalent of the Great Barrier Reef, and we should be looking after them and we should be proud of them. I haven't gone in a lot to the agricultural stuff, but some basic rules, and I think the key here is to make the basic payment contingent on the farmers following the rules. And these rules need to be bespoke to chalk catchments. And I'm talking about 20-meter buffers for the really destructive forms of farming, the pigs, the parsnips, the carrots, and so on, where basically you've got bare soil in the winter, because that's where the real problem is. No lifting after the end of October. Have a word with your supermarket about that. It's the supermarkets that want the nice soil-covered carrots in January that are the problem, because they demand that the farmers lift in January. And when farmers lift in January, they destroy your river. No gateways on the downhill edges or corners of fields, etc. Most of the ideas, in fact, all of the ideas that we're putting into the plan have come from conversations I've had with farmers. So this is not, this is coming from them, and all the farmers I've spoken to are very keen to see these things happen. And finally, an idea which is getting quite a lot of traction with the water companies and with the government is a national network of full catchment restoration. I've run out of time tonight to talk to you about the habitat end of things, which is probably the thing I know the most about, because I've been doing a full catchment restoration of the River Nar for the last 10 years. But I'm talking full catchment, thinking big, moving the river restoration game on a little bit. It's been reach-based by necessity over all of these years, because that's how the funding has come, and I've done lots and lots of that. But I do think that if we can think big and drive the restoration of the ecological and morphological processes, restore the gradient, remove all the impoundments, put all the gravel back in that was also taken out in those dreaded years, the 1940s to the 1980s, put the gravel back in, thus reconnect the river to the floodplain, and finally add habitat complexity with lots of trees and remeandering and wetlands. And I compare it to making yourself fit. You know, a fit and healthy chalk stream is much more able to tolerate some of the other slings and arrows we throw at them than our sort of morphologically damaged, dredged and impounded chalk streams. So that's my take-home generation game, and it's 4 minutes past 8, so I've overrun, I'm sorry, but there we go. That's my presentation. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen.